James was agitatedly walking in circles, or concentratedly staring down at his phone. He had been doing so for the entire night. If it hadn't been so concerning, it would have been remarkable how a human could keep himself in perpetual motion without a single pause in an aggravated state. At this point, the floor of Curie's room had a noticeable covering of black rub-off left by his shoes that formed a near-perfect oval shape that mirrored his endless march through this comb of the Rushgak hive. However, as impressive as it may have been to most other species how long he could keep up his pacing, it was likely still clear to most that his current behavior was far from healthy in the long run. Alright, it seems there's a number of angles we could approach our defense from, the most important one being that if you can personally object to the judge's evaluation of your mental state in a reasonable manner, they will at the very least have to budge to a more thorough investigation of your sanity than simply looking at your outward appearance, he mumbled, giving voice to some of the things he had learned during his pacing. He periodically did this, briefly interrupting his quiet concentration to share something he had learned before falling quiet again. However, the problem with that is that we don't know who will be choosing the experts conducting such an evaluation in that case, and if they are picked randomly, we will be extremely hard-pressed to find any impartial doctor out in the galaxy who will be willing to give your explanations the time of day. So ultimately, it is probably best if we put you into a shuttle back to Mars, and get you back under protective sanctuary. Curie followed his pacing with their gaze, moving their bodies slightly so they could keep their mechanical eyes on James at all times. "I believe that would be ill-advised," they stated, as they watched him turn into another circle. "Political tensions are already very high, and with the court order in place, you would make yourself guilty of withdrawal of a protected person, and thus both abduction as well as deprivation of liberty. Although Sheeta told my parents to come back with a warrant, I have high doubts that they will have any trouble obtaining one, and once they do, you will have to release me into their care." James shook his head heavily, while still going in circles. "I am still protected under the undenied candidacy section of galactic communal law," he said, rather dismissively, and waved it off with his hands. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't get me on the hook for it. However, in response, Curie also shook their body in an imitation of the human headshake. "That is only the case until the end of your candidacy. The punishment for such crimes would still follow after the election is over," it reminded him, as they really didn't want him to forget the consequences of the things that he did. "These crimes carry serious penalties. Do you really need that on your criminal record?" "I don't care," James said, with a determined downward gesture of his hands and a firm tone. Then he seemingly realized how he sounded, and sighed, obviously doing his best to temper his tone a bit. "I'm not going to just let them rob you of your freedom for being yourself. If I have to add another couple of points to the list of my crimes, then so be it." If Curie could have frowned, they would have at that moment. However, as things were, it was up to their voice to express their displeasure. "So you are planning to buy my freedom with your own?" they asked him, wishing to make sure they understood him correctly before they would cast any judgment. "Yes, if I have to, that's exactly what I'm going to do," James replied, with a strong determination in his voice that left no doubt that he was not only completely willing to do that, but also convinced that this was something that he was, in fact, going to do. With their worries confirmed, Curie stopped for a moment, no longer following James's pacing, as they internally processed his words and intentions. Could they have taken a deep breath? They likely would have at the time, while the reality and, more importantly, the determination of his words began to sink in with them. At least he was honest with them this time. They remembered the last time James had been determined to buy everyone else's freedom with his own. Back then, he had lied to them. He had told them he would follow when he could, and although he likely had every intention to do so in a way, Curie knew that James had also been very aware back then that he never expected that said when he could to ever become a reality. Still, they had believed him. They may have been the only one, but they believed him. But they had grown since then. Back then, he had not really given them a choice, but this time, he was saying it right to their face. At that moment, James's radio that was integrated into his breath filter, which was discarded onto a nearby side table, suddenly came to life. He had deliberately left its volume on maximum output, in case he would have to hear it at any point. 10 minutes till the conference, James. Sheeda's voice came from the device, reminding him of his more pressing duties. Although Sheeda had been just as agitated about this entire situation as James was, and so were many others of their friends, they all didn't have that same anger-burning stamina that kept the human going, and had therefore all been eventually forced to go and get some rest, while James eternally kept pacing. In the next lap of the room, he picked the filter up in passing and lifted it to his face. "I'll be there. Just give me another minute," he said without breaking his stride, before letting the device sink to his hips, while his face turned back to deep thought, as he stared at the phone in his other hand. "I'll make sure you have a flight booked that won't sell you out on your way back to Mars. I just have to find the right channels to—" "James, I don't want that," Curie interrupted him, finally breaking their silence once they were entirely sure about their feelings on the matter. Their artificial voice filled the room, cranked up to a high volume to make sure he wouldn't be able to miss it or keep talking over them, even on accident. At that moment, James halted his pacing for the first time in many hours, stopping dead in his tracks and staring over at Curie with a look of pure lack of understanding on his face. It didn't look like he did not understand or disagree with their reasoning. It seemed more like at that moment he was truly unable to comprehend what they had just told him. "James," they therefore repeated, speaking slowly and deliberately, now that his attention was purely on them. "I do not want you to send me away. I do not wish for you to break the law for me. The situation is bad enough as it is. I do not wish to make it any worse." James stared for a couple of moments, quite obviously trying to process what they were saying. "Curie, come on, you know that's not—" James tried to argue, but Curie shook their body once again. "No, James, that is exactly what it is. You are already fighting an uphill battle as it is. I refuse to be turned into another political weapon used against you by turning you into a criminal," they said firmly. "I am ready to defend myself from these court orders in any way I can, but I refuse to let you drag yourself down to such a level to do it." James sighed slightly in frustration. Even to Curie, it was clear that he was holding himself back from saying or doing things he would later regret in his agitated state. "Curie, these orders are a complete sham. We can't treat them like a legitimate judgment. And besides, I'm already a criminal in the galaxy's eyes, so what difference does it make?" he asked, in his most diplomatic tone, clearly quite intent on convincing Curie to just let him handle this for them. They of course knew it wasn't meant to be patronizing on his part, despite what his words and voice told them. "James," Curie replied to him, keeping their voice calm and diplomatic as well. "Not all the galaxy sees you as a criminal. Many are still looking up to you, but you jeopardize that with each and every poor decision that you make." Suddenly, there was a ring at the room's door. Using this as a break in the conversation, Curie quickly went to open it. In came Nia and Moore, although Curie could see the rest of the humans all waiting on the outside of the room as well. "You really need to get going, James," Nia said, in a mixture of strictness and compassion, as she looked at her brother, and James sighed in return. "Yes, in a minute," he said, in a tone that bordered on dismissiveness before he turned back to Curie. "Why don't you just let my reputation be my own worry for the time being?" he asked them, and again, Curie couldn't help but hear the undertone of, "just let me handle it," in his words. And at this point, there was something inside them that they hadn't really expected to ever feel towards James, but right now, it demanded that they let it out. They had enough of it. "Because it is my decision, James," they said, turning their voice firm and direct. "It is my life we are talking about here, and you don't get to decide for me." They paused for a moment and averted their gaze before they continued speaking. "I know that, in many ways, I am probably far less capable than you, and I know that you feel very aware of that. But while your reputation is your business, my own life is mine." They kept talking, their voice still serious, but not quite as firm as before anymore, as they needed to wrangle their own emotions towards their friend to get these words out. Inside of them, sincere gratitude and even love clashed harshly with a sense of slowly growing anger and even a hint of spite. "My parents do not get to decide over it, and neither do you." After they had spoken them, their words immediately sounded much harsher than Curie had intended them to be. In no way had Curie actually meant to imply that what James was trying to do for them was anywhere near as bad as the absolute control their parents wished to exert over them. They knew James's actions came from a place of genuine care and even understanding for their situation. However, they were out now, and at the very least they seemed to hit their intended mark, as James entirely froze up. He was fighting for Curie's and many others' rights to make their own decision. He could not go against that now, just because he had a bad feeling about what they decided. As he froze and looked back at Curie for a while, Nia suddenly put her hand on his shoulder and rubbed it heavily for a moment, while stepping to the side in a way that would make James look at both her and more, once he looked over to her. "James, you really need to get going," she then reminded him again, once his eyes were on her. It seemed she had very deliberately come here together with more. "Let us help Curie for now. You know I've got the experience, and you really don't need another human sitting around with you during that conference." James, of course, immediately tried to resist, as he said, "Yes, I know, but I can't just leave them." However, he was quite harshly interrupted when his sister reached for his face, pushing his cheeks together with her fingers and thumb, in a way that basically forced him to stop talking. "You're not a lawyer, James. You're not any more qualified to deal with this than anyone else," Nia reminded him, as she gently shook his head slightly side to side. But then, she let go of that harsher grasp and switched to just gently putting her hand onto his cheek, caressing it softly. Her voice also turned a lot softer as she continued. "You don't have to do it all, James. You've got enough on your plate. Just let us help here." From behind her, Maud nodded, and also reached her long arm down to put her claw onto James's shoulder.
"She is right, James,"
the kind old Raphaelite said in a high, calming voice.
"There may be many things that you have to be the one to do on the basis of your position, but this is not one of them. We are all Curie's friends, and we all wish to help them. And Curie has made a decision for themselves as well, so please trust them and trust us, and focus your energy on the things really only you can do. You have important things to take care of, and you can trust us to keep your back free while you do so."
James stared back at them for some more time, his face speaking abundantly of indecision. "Tick-tock, James!" Coco's voice suddenly came from up the stairs, reminding once again about the pressing time. And eventually, James caved. It didn't seem like he was entirely convinced, but his more immediate duties at the very least seemed to win out in his mind now that he knew someone else would take care of things here. With a nod, but no words, he turned to exit the room and join up with his team, to quickly get in front of a camera so he could be present for the conference. Everyone who stayed in the room looked after him for a moment, as he closed the door behind himself securely. "He is really beginning to convince himself that this is all his responsibility," Curie acknowledged aloud to the other two. Nia nodded and sighed slightly, Yep, and we better put a stop to that idea right now before it really sets in his mind. She agreed with Curie, and shook her head for a moment longer before turning towards them. But I really think his heart is in the right place with it. Oh, I know, Curie replied. I will admit I may have overreacted slightly earlier. My parents' actions may have me a bit more on edge than I would usually be, and it led to me reacting to James's actions stronger than would be appropriate. I will tell him I am sorry once I can. Moore now stepped deeper into the room, before sinking into a sitting position with a heavy headshake that made her fur rustle, and her large horns threateningly wave through the air.
I do not think anyone could fault you for it,
the Raphaelite said, with a deep, dissatisfied huffing noise.
To do something like this to your own child, I am surprised you were not crawling up the walls in anger. I know I am certainly tempted to do so, and I am not even directly affected. Why, if I was only a couple of years younger, I would be tempted to...
She cut herself off there, in another huff, but Curie felt like they understood her meaning. Thank you, Moore, they replied, with an appreciative lowering of their body. Your support means a lot. I do not tend to get furious like many other people. However, this current situation certainly has me in a state that feels unlike myself. Oh, I can certainly relate to that, Nia agreed, and walked over to them as well. Unlike her brother, Nia didn't fill the room with a nervous energy by constantly pacing, and soon joined Moore in sitting down in a comparatively calm manner. I remember I was a crying mess back when I found out that my parents tried to pull this same shit on me. I don't think anyone could stay completely collected with something like that going on in their life. She sighed in a way that was most likely meant to alleviate some of her own emotions and memories, haunting her mind at that moment. Curie looked over at her. You mentioned that they tried to put you under a guardianship before. They spoke to Nia, appreciative of her held-back demeanour, after James's abrasive agitation that had become a bit much for them over time. How did you manage to challenge it? Nia sighed again, and smiled up at Curie with a hint of guilty awkwardness. Well, I was still pretty young at the time, so others did most of the challenging for me back then, mostly Flynn and Sophia, she admitted outright, seemingly not wishing to present herself as more competent than she actually was. And even if that wasn't the case, that was a human process in front of a human judge, who was pretty quick to throw it out once he saw what was happening. Very different from your situation, where basically the opposite happened. So you are saying that the person presiding over the process and their personal views play a large part in its outcome, despite it being a legal issue. Curie tried to understand what Nia was trying to tell them. With legal issues, they had usually expected things to be clearer cut than depending on personal emotions and values. However, they had admittedly only rarely come into actual contact with the law in any meaningful ways. Nia solemnly nodded at their words. I'm sorry to say that that's often the case, and I'm afraid getting an amenable judge might be pretty hard in your case, she informed them with mild hesitation. In that case, I'll just have to make my case strong enough to convince any judge of my unquestionable sanity, Curie stated directly, which caused Nia to look up in mild surprise. She made it quite obvious that she hadn't expected such confidence to come out of Curie. However, after a moment, she smiled at it. Yeah, she nodded, along with Curie's words, although a background of worry remained on her face. But for now, we need to make sure that you're all right until we actually get to that point. She straightened herself into a more professional position, and turned more directly towards Curie as she continued talking. For now, have you personally contacted everyone back on Mars to inform them about your current position? I'm pretty sure the others have already done the basic informing, but I still say everyone should hear from you personally. I'm pretty sure if you ask your employer and bank directly, they are not going to just keel over at the request to hand you and your assets over to your parents before that court order wasn't at least challenged to a proper level.
That does sound like a good decision. Securing any level of independence you possibly can for yourself should certainly be your first step, considering all the proper court proceedings are already being put into motion for you. In fact, it may be that some of the company's lawyers of your employer could be able to help you out with some of the steps as well.
Moore agreed to Nia's words and briefly stroked for the long fur on her neck.
It may not be entirely comparable, but Moeen has told me that the legal team of his own employment has been a great help with clearing up the legal issues caused between his wife and her family after their marriage, so it might be worth a shot.
Curie pondered that suggestion for a while, but ultimately decided that those two were right. Still, a sinking feeling took hold of their body at the thought of calling their employers at Nairobi Dynamic Robotics and asking for such a favour. Especially since they were already in some trouble because of Curie's actions, even if the cyborg had been told not to worry about it.
Is everything all right, Curie?
Moore suddenly asked, seemingly having picked up on something in their behaviour.
You seem rather lost in thought.
My employers, they already had to fix some issues for me. I am feeling slightly anxious about being a burden to them again, the cyborg quickly replied.
Oh,
Moore said carefully.
Right, you mentioned something like that before, though you said you could not elaborate on it any further.
Curie looked to the ground for a moment. However, their gaze was pulled back upwards when Nia made a dismissive sound through her lips. Whatever. That's literally their job, she said with a shrug of her shoulders. That's what big companies like that have a legal team for. I can guarantee you, even if they do everything perfectly up to code, Nadi Rowe is probably hit with more legal questions and troubles in a day than any normal person will see their entire life. Whatever you did will barely be a droplet in the ocean of filings and processes they have to deal with every day, I can guarantee you. Of course, I can't promise that they'll be either able or willing to help with your personal problems here, but that's up for them to decide once you inform them about your situation. You shouldn't put the option off just because you actually made them do their job once. Who knows, maybe they'll even be eager to, depending on how much they value you as an employee. Curie paused again and slightly shifted their body, as they thought about her words once again. It wasn't the first time they had been told something similar to that. Most of their co-workers had expressed quite similar sentiments, as the troubles they had caused had first emerged. However, they had thought the humans were just trying to be friendly and forgiving back then. All right, I will give them a call, Curie finally stated with another nod, if only to warn them of the possible upcoming troubles approaching them.
Curie, if you do not mind me asking...
Moore then carefully approached them again and shifted her position slightly to sit a bit straighter, much like Nia had done before.
What exactly were those troubles that you apparently caused your employer? I understand that you were told not to talk about it, but I think that, in this room, we all know how to keep a secret between each other.
Curie averted their gaze even more. In truth, they absolutely hated having to keep this secret. They still absolutely despised dishonesty, even just by omission. And the fact that they had to do it to their friends was absolutely eating them up inside. Of course, they had guaranteed Nadi Rowe's legal team that they would keep silent about it. And as their honest outlook on the world had, in a way, played no small part in the situation even arising in the first place, they were very intent on keeping their words. However, right now, with everything that was happening, and with Moore asking so directly, they yearned for the peace of mind that telling the truth would give them. And they also knew that it was true that what they had to say would not leave this room, nor would it reflect negatively on the likely still ongoing legal proceedings. Ultimately, in their eternal battle of what they valued more, honesty towards their close friends or keeping their word to their employer, even if breaking it would have no consequences. The honesty ultimately won out. "The troubles are about my drone designs that I refined for Nadi Ro," they finally stated, after a moment of steeling themselves. "For Nadi Ro, they are a highly sought-after piece of technology that they greatly supported me in developing, based on my first designs from back on the GES-32. However, while working for them, I made the mistake of doing what I usually did. Part of my contract was that I would be allowed to share any technical breakthroughs of my finding without any restrictions, so the galaxy may benefit from them. On Nadi Ro's side, this was intended to only mean the technical details that could be used and adapted in other technologies. However, I understood it as doing what I always did, and releasing my blueprints and descriptions for use. Technically, that should not have been a problem either. However, my lack of possessiveness over them turned into a problem. When the time came that the drones were ready for open testing and approval stages, Nadi Ro suddenly ran into a legal wall, as another company had apparently already claimed drones of my design as their own intellectual property, after copying my designs from the net. And since you don't sign your blueprints, that means Nadi Ro now has to go through the process of proving that you are, in fact, the inventor of said designs, and thus hold the intellectual property rights by default, even if that other company tried to register them before Nadi Ro did," Nia assumed, after listening to their words with a small sigh. Curie nodded. "That is indeed the case," they confirmed. "I was told multiple times to claim my work as my own, openly and proudly, and I will admit I was warned of the very possibility of bad actors using my insistence on not limiting the scientific progress to further their own selfish wants. I guess, in my own stubbornness, I never quite wanted it to be real, until the case actually became reality." They still felt bad about what had happened. Their stubbornness to be absolutely open in every case, despite others' numerous warnings, had caused a rather uncomfortable position. They had by now accepted that it was just one of the many social repercussions they faced, after putting themselves under social isolation for so many years, that they simply never learned the difference between honesty and naivety. Still, they had also been assured that the issue would ultimately be easy enough to clear up. Apparently, a proceeding like this one would ultimately be lengthy, but not all too difficult, given the abundance of evidence that Curie was the drone's original inventor. It would simply take a long process of discovery between the two parties, during which Nadi Ro wanted as little as possible to be made public about the entire proceeding, which was why they asked Curie to remain silent about it. Nia shrugged by now. "A company like that probably has to deal with copyright and patent disputes on such a regular basis that is pure routine for them at this point," she said rather nonchalantly, clearly both still trying to calm Curie about the event, and firmly believing her words to be true at the same time. "I won't worry too much about it." However, to Curie's surprise, Morno had an exceptionally thoughtful look on her face that held for quite a while.
"Remind me, Nia,"
the Raphaelite then said after some time.
"Forgive me for bringing it up, but your parents tried to put you under a guardianship because they did not agree with the decisions you made about your life and, specifically, your body, correct?"
Nia looked over at her for a moment before nodding. Although it obviously wasn't her favourite topic, she seemed to be able to talk about it without much problem, at least in a safe setting like this. "That's right. Pretty much what is happening to Curie as well. Why are you asking?" she wondered.
"But even they did not attempt to put you under a conservatorship as well,"
Moore continued her questioning, while Curie curiously watched on. Nia blinked twice. "No, I mean, I didn't really have enough money for it to matter all that much anyway. But still, no, they didn't. They were only worried about my, physical state and my location. They didn't really care about my finances as well," she then confirmed, with yet another shrug after a moment of thinking. "Not like your finances matter all too much if your entire life is being controlled." Moore nodded her large head.
That is what I have been thinking as well,
the old lady then agreed very thoughtfully.
Even imagining myself at my most zealous, absolutely determined to keep my children safe from themselves, even if I have to take their freedom away to achieve it. I mean, it is hard to imagine such a thing in the first place, but assuming I would, I find the part of both these processes being put into motion at the same time rather hard to believe. I mean, I guess I could see them just grasping at any straw of control they can reach, so it is not unbelievable in that way. It may just be me being paranoid, in fact, but after what Curie just told us, it occurred to me that maybe...
She seemed to not quite want to say it out loud. However, Curie had already caught on to what she was trying to say, and thus took it upon themselves to finish her sentence for her. That maybe they have alternate intentions, apart from controlling my life with their actions, correct? They assumed. I cannot claim I haven't thought about it myself. After all, they have not cared about me for the last uniform year, at the very least. The way that they showed up so suddenly now is certainly suspicious. Of course, a change of mind is not entirely unbelievable. However, something makes me doubt that at least one of them does not have at least some alternative motive behind their actions. With their vor, Curie could honestly believe that, in their own crooked way, they somewhat cared about their child, and planned to do what they believed to be the best thing for them. With their mish, however, Curie couldn't quite see things the same way. Still, in the end, it doesn't really matter what their intentions are, the cyborg stated self-assuredly. We simply have to make sure they don't get the chance to make them a reality. They then reached over to their phone, preparing to make the necessary phone calls, to prepare to defend their right to live for themselves.